Nikki! Hello! Everybody has something compelling to say. They just need to figure out the best way to say it.
Long story, but...
Long story, but?
Wait, I'm saying it's a long story? Okay, here we go.
Long story, but...
Long story, no. That's a good question.
It's a long story, but...
Oh, long story, but...
Is the long story, but...
Long story, but...
Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to chat with my good friend, Mike.
My name is Michael Magee. I am a PhD candidate in the Political Science Department at the University of Oregon, and I study contemporary right and left-wing armed paramilitary political organizations. So it's a long story, but armed political militias are both far more powerful and far more mainstream than most people are ready to admit or that we're ready for.
Wait, the what?
My research is trying to examine and understand what I call contemporary paramilitary political organizations. That's a very big academic mouthful. Basically, the folks that show up to political things with guns. So the one that comes to mind for most people is the militia movement, which was big in the 1990s and now has reemerged today. But I also, that's like kind of the right-wing version of it. But I also look at the left-wing version of armed political groups, and I do a bit of a comparison between them to try to understand what motivates and animates their politics, what kind of rhetoric and discourse they use, what it is they want or are trying to achieve. And what I'm particularly interested in is how they wield and also produce, and of course reproduce, right, the myths and tropes of American national identity, and what work those do for these organizations. Because I think you see it in a real big way on the right, but also in more interesting ways, I think, in left-wing groups, especially really contemporary ones.
So who are these groups? Where does this all come from? And what is the militia movement?
Most scholars of the militia movement trace it back to the 1960s. At least, in the thing that looks the most like its contemporary form, or that you can see a clear genealogy. In the 1960s, there was this group called the John Birch Society. And John Birch Society was this anti-Semitic, conspiracy theory-driven political organization that was not explicitly radical right-wing or not explicitly racist or explicitly, sort of proto-fascist like something like the Klan was or the American Nazi Party. But they were certainly fellow travelers. And that's a very common story with the right-wing militia groups in the U.S. today that you're going to hear me talk about a lot, is that they're not explicitly anti-Semitic, racist, Islamophobic. Well, actually, that's not true. They're pretty explicitly Islamophobic frequently. And they would claim that, they're not racist, but they are frequently fellow travelers with groups that are activists. John Birch Society was in the 1960s. It was this group of conspiracy theory-driven, anti-Semitic, radical right-wing group that, had this idea that there was this Jewish worldwide conspiracy that was going to take over the American government. They were vehemently anti-communist because communism was connected to Judaism. And they were anti-labor because, the way anti-Semitism works is it's the idea that those who are downtrodden in society, like African Americans or workers or ethnic white immigrants, the only way that they're able to achieve any gains must only be because they have elite allies who are in power. And frequently that role is filled in this mythology by Jews. So the John Birch Society, this was during the Civil Rights era, the only way that African Americans could be achieving these gains, it must be the case that there are some kind of elites at the top pulling the strings, who are the Jews, and they are out to fundamentally remake America into some kind of communist whatever, and undo the American white male, as the central figure of American society. That's the John Birch Society. And they are pretty powerful, in fact, and they have a pretty large organizing apparatus. They have a newsletter that goes out that has thousands of subscribers, and they are on the scene in this moment of this nascent conservative movement that was bubbling up in the 1960s. So, since the New Deal era and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Republican Party and conservatism have effectively been considered by most political commentators and politicians themselves, and political scientists for that matter, as dead on arrival. There seems to be this consensus after World War II where both parties are on board, at least in broad terms, with New Deal-style state intervention in the economy. strong military, strong national defense, and internationalism, right? This broad agreement that America ought to be involved in foreign affairs and be a world leader. It's called by political scientists and historians the New Deal consensus, right? Even Eisenhower was on board with the New Deal, and he was a Republican. That starts to change in the 1960s when there is a new movement that's coming up, bubbling up, both from the grassroots but also from elites that are rejecting the New Deal order. They're arguing that the state ought not be involved heavily in regulating the economy, that government needs to be dramatically pared down in terms of its size and the scope of its authority. And the John Birch Society is part of that broad movement or event. They link up with more mainstream forms of conservatism in the form of the Republican Party and in the form of intellectual elites at the National Review, which is a magazine founded by William F. Buckley Jr. and a number of other conservative intellectuals. Isn't quite the right word. I don't think Buckley was an intellectual, although Buckley was really good. He was very charismatic, and he was able to bring in actual conservative intellectuals into this magazine, into this journal, who would then publish think pieces every week on conservative ideas. And the magazine's still going, in fact. So all these different sorts of tendrils of this nascent conservative movement are coalescing and becoming more and more mainstream. And the John Birch Society is trying to be part of that. Interestingly enough, William F. Buckley Jr. himself pens a piece in the National Review where he basically says, John Birch Society, you're not part of our club. You are too wacko, you are too far out there. You were useful to us early on because you had a lot of active members, but we don't want you anymore. So the John Birch Society kind of dies away. The conspiracy theory-driven radical right, it exists. It's sort of, bubbling under the surface in small ways for the next couple decades, but it's not really a big deal. It doesn't really have much effect or much relevance to American politics. Fast forward to the early 1990s. You have Bill Clinton as president, first Democrat since Reagan, after 3 terms of Republican dominance. You have 2 seminal events that sort of shape the worldview of the contemporary militia movement and the 1990s militia movement, which is Waco and Ruby Ridge. Ruby Ridge was the first one. The case was, there was this guy who was in trouble for firearms possession charges. He had possessed a stockpile of firearms. He holed up in his house with his wife and child, and the FBI and the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Administration came to his house and basically laid siege to it for a number of days. Over the course of that siege, his wife and child are shot and killed, and he eventually is arrested after surrendering. This sparks a lot of outrage in conservative circles because it's seen as a state overreach. It's seen as federal government exacting tyranny over this guy who, was just trying to exercise his constitutional Second Amendment right, who they see as someone who was persecuted and who becomes a martyr. And then this is followed up shortly after with Waco, which is much more well known. So in Waco, Texas, there is this compound of a church called the Branch Davidians, which is a Christian fundamentalist evangelical sect. And it's this compound where all of the believers hang out. So the leader of the Branch Davidians is charged with some kind of firearms possession charges. And a similar thing happens. ATF and the FBI come and lay siege to the compound. The siege goes on for a number of days. The SWAT team and FBI negotiators try to reach some kind of settlement. It's unsuccessful. And what eventually happens is law enforcement decides to use this machine battering ram, effectively, to smash part of the compound. And recollections differ, let's say, as to what happens next. According to law enforcement, they found evidence to suggest that the Branch Davidian members set their own compound on fire in an effort to, sort of go down swinging, I suppose. The Branch Davidians who survived and those in right-wing groups who thought this was a bad thing that happened claimed that it was, in fact, the FBI using this battering ram machine that started a fire. And the fire killed dozens of people, including, women and children. So that's what happens in Waco. And so these 2 events form the core of a resurgent militia movement, radical right-wing, conspiracy theory-driven movement in the United States. And the 1990s, you see an explosion of these organizations. Some of the biggest ones include the Idaho Militia, the Michigan Militia, and these are groups that, because it's the 90s and the internet's now a thing, They have a huge presence online. They begin organizing. You can still find some of their websites, which I recommend if you're interested in some bizarre entertainment, because these websites are like, made in GeoCities, and they have these really grainy GIFs of American flags waving. It's really, really interesting stuff. But the movement explodes, and there's different branches of it. But the branch that matters the most is the most radical branch. And this is the branch that motivates Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. So Timothy McVeigh is this guy who has this big cargo van full of explosives and charges it into the federal government building in Oklahoma City and kills dozens of people. It's the worst terrorist attack in the U.S. until 9/11, of course. After that, investigators go to his house and they find all this literature that's inspired by the militia movement. There's one book in particular, it's called The Turner Diaries. And The Turner Diaries is this fictionalized novel about this wave of immigrants and communists coming to the U.S. and instituting a new world order. And it's about this heroic survivalist prepper who leads an armed resistance against this new oppressive tyrannical government. And that book kind of becomes like the central core text of the militia movement is the Turner Diaries. They find that in Timothy McVeigh. So after that happens, the FBI and the federal government severely crack down on right-wing militia activity. They began arresting people. So at that point, we're sort of in the mid-1990s, and the movement dies down a bit. It just kind of becomes much more underground and much more online focused, in part because they're actually being cracked down on by the federal government, and in part because the more, quote-unquote moderate segments of the movement don't want the kind of heat and don't want to be seen as connected to Timothy McVeigh, which most of the American public at the time does. They say, oh, Timothy McVeigh, Oklahoma City bombing happened to be because of these wacko right-wing militia groups. By the time you end the 1990s, these groups are basically gone away again. George Bush comes into office, 9/11 happens. You then start to see after 9/11, as in all of American society, you see a shift in the rhetoric of militia movements from this kind of either explicit or implicit anti-Semitism to a strong anti-Islamic rhetoric. And during the Bush years, the militia movement, it doesn't really become prominent. There's, in part because conservatives are in government, so they don't have much to complain about the federal government. But then you come to Obamacare, right, sparks all these fears among conservatives about government overreach, FEMA death camps. Well, that fits perfectly into this narrative that was constructed by the 1990s militia movement, inspired by the Turner Diaries, where the government's plan ultimately, through this global Jewish, communist, whatever you want to call it, conspiracy, is going to institute a new world order, and the American Constitution is going to be burned, and there's going to be a new government that comes in. The UN is going to send troops to the United States. Details vary, but some version of this, and they're going to overthrow the U.S. government. The common man is going to be oppressed, and the only way to fight it is going to be through armed resistance. These fears about Obamacare and FEMA death camps and government overreach fit in very neatly with that pre-existing narrative. And so the Tea Party happens, which is kind of a more mainstream, social movement funded by the Koch brothers, etc. But then you also see at the same time this new resurgence, again, a sort of second resurgence of the militia movement. And in particular, two major organizations. There's the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers. And they are now the dominant right-wing militia organizations. And there's like hundreds of chapters and there's various fractures within them. But that's kind of where we are now. There are these really active right-wing militia groups that are composed of predominantly former military veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, police officers, active and former, who see it as their mission to prevent any kind of government overreach or tyranny. The Oath Keepers, their name refers to the oath that a member of the military or a member of the police or the firefighters or whatever gives when they first take their job to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So an Oath Keeper is somebody who, even though they're retired or no longer active duty, they commit to upholding that oath. And what that means to them is they will fight an external power like the UN coming in, or they'll fight an internal constitutional insurrection where the federal government violates the Constitution. The Three Percenters are also a right-wing militia group, and their name refers to, going back to bad historical facts, it refers to their claim that only 3% of American colonists actually fought the British. So they say that it only takes 3% of the population to overthrow a tyrannical government. we are that 3%. Kind of a vanguardist, Leninist approach almost. So what we've seen really since the Obama era, we've seen a big resurgence in right-wing activism. So what I mean by that is not necessarily just like the GOP, not just the Republican Party establishment. They've always been around. But what we're seeing is much more activism in terms of organizing around issues and rhetoric and desires, right, that are folks who are generally speaking like anti-government conservatives who have a more radical militant approach to things, right? Rather than working within, say, the bounds of institutional American politics, they're much more doing kind of grassroots organizing. And I think my interest kind of went from the Tea Party to my master's thesis, in fact, was on Ron Paul in particular, and how Ron Paul and the libertarian movement that coalesced around him in those couple elections really emphasized American history and the Constitution and the founding to justify itself. And so then that led me to okay, well, let's look at these militia groups.
So that's right-wing militias, but what are left-wing militias? What does that look like?
I'm not nearly as well versed in the history of left-wing armed organizing because so much of my work prior has been focused on the right. But I'll tell you what I do know. The reason I got interested in the left-wing groups is because there was a protest, it was a couple years ago, in some small American city where the Oath Keepers and 3%ers showed up. It was, sort of in the Trump election moment. At the same time, a group of counter-protesters showed up armed. And these two groups sort of stared across each other across the street. Tensions were high. But what happened was, at some point, both groups started chanting USA, USA, USA. And that struck me as very odd, because in the history of left-wing radical activism in the United States, they frequently do not endorse American national identity. They often condemn the American project, the American state, the American nation as colonialist, as complicit in genocide, as promoting slavery, all the nasty things of American history, right? Left-wing groups frequently want to distance themselves from it, and in fact, they organize themselves around opposition to America and Americanness. But here was an armed left-wing group that was chanting alongside a right-wing group a nationalist chant. And so I started to look into it, and in around 2016, two groups that are related emerged on the left. One is called the John Brown Gun Club, and the second is called Redneck Revolt. The John Brown Gun Club is, as the name might suggest, a gun club for those who think that armed community self-defense is a desirable and good form of political practice, and that vulnerable communities such as, say, African-American communities, such as, the gays, etc., working people, working class people, need to arm themselves to resist state oppression. That's a John Brown Gun Club. And so they have a number of chapters across the United States, and they see their mission as arming themselves, teaching themselves how to defend themselves via weapons to defend their own communities because they're leftists, and so leftists and, they're sort of some variety of anarchists. They see the state as itself a form of oppression and a form of violence, and they think that the only way to resist that violence is through violence, or at least one of the more effective ways, if not the only way. Connected to this is a group called Redneck Revolt, and this is an organization that also emerged around 2016 that gets their name from their claim that redneck is while we often think of it as a derogatory term, it comes from the radical labor history of the Appalachian Mountains, when Appalachian coal miners would put on red bandanas around their necks when they were striking or engaged in some kind of radical action, such as the Battle of Blair Mountain, where union workers, where mine workers and company thugs fought it out, and dozens were killed. And so they are trying to actively recapture that identity of redneck and use it as a way to organize a radical leftist politics that focuses on arms. So these folks will show up to demonstrations where right-wing militia groups show up, and they'll counter-demonstrate armed, just like right-wing groups show up armed. And so in some ways, they, on the face of it, they look like kind of mirror images of each other. And so what I wanted to do is explore further, what actually is the connective tissue here? Are these groups similar? Are they actually fundamentally distinct? Why is it the case that they seem to have found some kind of common connection in American national identity? and just basically what's going on with this. So that's the contemporary left-wing groups. I don't know, again, a ton about like the history. I can't give like the full genealogy, but what I do know is that the contemporary groups explicitly derive inspiration from moments of left-wing armed resistance in the past, in particular the early versions of the Black Panthers, where, the Black Panthers, we often remember them as strictly an armed organization. They were far more than that. But one of the things they did do was armed patrols in their neighborhoods in an effort to intimidate police, in an effort to prevent police from abusing their power in black neighborhoods. These folks would drive around in the back of pickup trucks with shotguns. They derive their inspiration from, again, as their name would suggest in the John Brown Gun Club, from John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. This very radical historical event that most Americans view sort of ambivalently, right? Most Americans view John Brown, if they even know who he is.
For those who don't know, John Brown was an abolitionist who led a small group on a raid against the federal armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. His goal was to start an armed slave revolt and end the institution of slavery. Brown was born into an anti-slavery family in 1800 in Connecticut. Despite stumbling through his early life, failing at countless business ventures, his life was altered dramatically and irrevocably when he attended an abolition meeting in Cleveland in 1837. He was so impacted by the meeting that he dedicated his life to destroying slavery, and within the decade was planning a slave revolt. In the 1850s, he traveled with his sons to Kansas, a territory at the time, to fight against the pro-slavery forces in the area. Battles between Brown, with his fellow abolitionists, and the pro-slavery residents of the nearby towns led to a summer of guerrilla warfare. By 1857, Brown was heading east, where he found support of 6 prominent abolitionists, known as the Secret Six. An invasion force was assembled, and Brown's force grew to 22 men, including 5 black men and 3 of Brown's own sons. Brown asked Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass to join the raid, both of whom he had met during his years as an abolitionist. Tubman fell ill, and Douglass declined, as he felt that the raid could not possibly succeed. Forging forward, the group headed to Maryland and began to plan the assault on Harper's Ferry. On October 16, 1859, Brown and his band of men overran the arsenal. Some of his men rounded up hostages, including slaves. Word of the raid spread fast, and by morning Brown and his men were surrounded. A company of U.S. Marines, led by First Lieutenant Israel Green with Colonel Robert E. Lee in command, arrived the following day. On October 19th, the Marines overran Brown and his men, 10 of which were killed, 2 were Brown's sons. Brown was wounded but survived, and was tried for treason and murder in the state of Virginia. He was found guilty on November 2nd, and was sent to the gallows on December 2nd, 1859. Just before his execution, the 59-year-old handed his guard a piece of paper, which read, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Brown is known for leading the raid, which, despite failing, raised stakes in the 1860 election and fueled tensions between the North and South, becoming an important impetus of the American Civil War.
They see him as somebody who maybe had the right ideals but was too much of an extremist. These folks see John Brown as somebody that they should emulate. That like, the way to achieve radical freedom in the U.S. is to insurrect against the government through arms. And just talk a little bit more about the left-wing groups, what they do. So not only do they train people on guns and self-defense, but they also actively try to counter-organize from the right-wing groups. So these, like the John Brown Gun Club, will show up to gun shows in rural areas and have a booth. And they will try to convince people, rather than seeing the evils of the world as a result of Jews or of liberals or of communists, to say, like, no, actually, like, yes, you are suffering. You are a white working class person who is suffering, but it's not because Barack Obama wants to take away your guns and liberty. It's because capitalism, or it's because structural racism or whatever. So they're trying to counter-organize, and they're trying to make inroads into these right-wing groups on the shared foundation of guns. Is like guns are a really important connective tissue here. Some people in the John Brown Gun Club like to joke that if you go far enough left, you get to have your guns back. They argue that in order for communities to be able to have autonomy, they have to be able to defend themselves, because we can't rely on the state to defend us, because the state is itself owned by capitalists, it's racist, it's structured by inequality. These liberals who want gun control, the only result that's going to have is that already marginalized communities are going to be even more marginalized, and the enforcement of gun control measures are certainly going to fall harder on, say, black communities than white communities. So that's kind of the nature of the debate there, and where they position themselves relative to the American mainstream. Both sets have experienced a number of fractures, a number of fragmentations. They're stronger in certain parts of the country versus others. So that's kind of where things lay with the right and left-wing groups now.
It's clear that both sides have political interests and how people may get involved. But how does one come to study these movements?
In terms of how I got interested in this, so when I came to grad school, I knew I wanted to study the American right in some form or fashion. And I came to grad school in 2014. The latest and greatest thing in conservative studies was the Tea Party, which of course was the big thing that happened in circa 2009, 2010. So I came to the University of Oregon to work with a guy named Joe Lowndes, who wrote a book on the rise of the conservative movement in the 1960s and 70s. Really great scholar and public intellectual and radical activist, good guy. I highly recommend his work. His book's called From the New Deal to the New Right. I'm giving him a plug for my advisor here. It's only because I actually think he does really good work. He has a new book co-authored with another former faculty member at the University of Oregon called Producers, Patriots, and Parasites, which is all about contemporary radical right-wing activism. So I came to UO to work with him, and my first projects were looking at sort of more historically the rise of the conservative movement in the U.S., pretty conventional social science-y or historical questions, what were the variables that caused this outcome? Why was it the case that the Republican Party, after being a whole generation or almost 2 generations in abeyance, suddenly came to the fore in the 1970s and 60s, with Nixon and then with Ronald Reagan? So questions like that, and then it kind of became more and more contemporary as I advanced through graduate school. And the question I kept frequently coming back to was looking at these like weird examples of in the Tea Party where not only is the movement itself grounding, its name in a particular historical event, right, the Boston Tea Party, but also these folks were like dressing up in costumes and were like pretending to be founding fathers or Minutemen and, had tricorn hats and wigs and everything else. And so the kernel of all the things I've always been interested in, I realized, was how is the past made political in the present? Like, how are these people using history for political ends now? And when I started doing some, kind of background work like you do as a good academic, you look at the literature and everything else, a lot of stuff in political science and social sciences, I think, is really bad at doing this kind of work and gets it wrong, because they'll do things like say, well, the Tea Party as a social movement just gets their history wrong, and so therefore shouldn't be taken seriously. Which, that's true, right? They have their facts wrong about what actually happened in the Boston Tea Party or the American Revolution all the time, but that's not what matters, right? It's clear that this, whatever sort of version of history they're using, is doing real political work for them and is mobilizing and animating an entire social movement. These kind of elite liberal academics or media commentators or whatever, kind of like to scoff and say, oh, well, they don't understand that, here's was the real dynamic at the time and during the founding era. Like, that doesn't matter. So I take a much more cultural studies approach to things because, people are making meaning of their history and their politics. So what my project is trying to do is to understand these groups on their own terms and then trying to think through what forms of national identity are animating these groups. With the left-wing group, it seems like they're drawing on some moments of American history, such as the Battle of for Blair Mountain, such as John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. So does that mean then that they are trying to constitute some kind of counter-narrative of American national identity, American history that they can use, that is useful to them? Or is it simply the case that, like so many other leftist groups, they in fact reject American history and this is just kind of a convenient, name that they give themselves? And then also, I'm in a political science department, but I fancy myself as much more of a political theorist than just a straight social scientist. And what that means is that gives me an excuse to actually explore normative questions in ways that social science often is uncomfortable doing. So I want to know, is this good? Is it the case that we can have a radical emancipatory politics that grounds itself in a certain version of American identity and that likes guns? Is that something that's good? Should we pursue that? Is it desirable? So, I'm tipping my hand on my own politics, right? I'm somewhere on the left, and I think the left-wing groups have some things right. I would prefer if we didn't have right-wing militias in the streets, but I think we need to ask the question, is one or the other of these groups, are they onto something?
This country is diverse and complex, and there's going to be different areas that have different sets of politics, so you're going to have bigger groups that are right or left in different areas. But is there any information on parts of the country that are stronger on one side or the other? Like, are there these left organized militias in more urban spaces where you might have more diverse populations that could understand defending themselves against police? Or is this kind of across the board, it just depends on where you are?
I think in general, it's correct to say you find more radical left-wing organizing in more population-dense areas, and you find right-wing militia organizing in rural areas. I think that's generally correct. And just to give the example I know best, which is the Pacific Northwest, as you might imagine. Not just because I happen to be here and study here, but also the Northwest is a huge hotbed for organizing in both of these groups. Yeah, little known fact, like you and I, we went to grad school in Oregon, so like we have a sense of this, but people like to think of the Northwest as this idyllic sort of liberal utopia. Just beneath that veneer is this like deep history of white supremacy, of the Klan, of really nasty stuff. And that has not just gone away.
Again, for those who don't know, Oregon holds a rather complex history of race relations. Oregon entered the nation as a free state, but did so with laws that excluded non-white bodies. So, while slavery was outlawed, black people were not allowed in the state legally. This was enforced with the Lash Law. This then expanded to other populations. For example, in the 1860s, Oregon passed laws that meant black and Asian folks had to pay a tax to be in the state and could not marry a white person. Oregon didn't ratify the 14th Amendment, the amendment that ensures equal protection and rights of former slaves, or the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote. And it wasn't until 2001 that the language of exclusion was removed from the state constitution. This history has allowed for the state and the larger Pacific Northwest region to remain a breeding ground for those who deeply believe in the white utopia that Oregon was intended to be.
In the Northwest, you especially see a lot of right-wing groups. But just talk a little bit about what I know in terms of demographics and where these people operate. In terms of the left-wing groups, you see them a lot in more urban spaces, and they often align themselves with anti-fascist organizations. The so-called Antifa, right? In Portland, for example, just about every summer, like clockwork in Portland, there ends up being some kind of street fight between left and right-wing activists. So, there was kind of an offshoot of the Patriot movement called Patriot Prayer, which is run by this guy named Joey Gibson here in the Northwest, and he lives in Washington. He, in fact, ran for a state house and lost last election cycle. But he'll come down to Portland and bus a bunch of people in, including Proud Boys and alt-right groups, to sort of demonstrate against whatever. They'll demonstrate against communism in Portland. They'll demonstrate against, just whatever issue they can drum up. And left-wing groups will come to counter-protest. And, of course, anti-fascist groups see themselves as the vanguard for defending against the rise of fascism. And so they will come to counter-protest. Usually don't bring guns, but they'll come, pretty heavily equipped. And you'll have these face-offs that frequently will devolve into street fighting at some point in the day. And the police get involved and shoot tear gas at people. I was at one, and I got shot at with tear gas. I was just sitting there with my backpack like, I'm a grad student. I'm just here to do some ethnography. So it gets pretty wild. So that has happened over and over again. And the gun groups show up in Portland on both sides, but I would say the left-wing groups have more of a foothold there. But there's also groups like, for instance, here in Eugene, there's the Lane County Rifles, which is a left-wing organization. In terms of Redneck Revolt and John Brown Gun Club, you'll see there's a big one in Arizona, there's a big one in the Puget Sound area near Seattle. So they're more heavily dominated in urban areas, but there's also some in rural areas, and they are actively trying to recruit in rural areas. The right-wing groups, by strong contrast, are almost exclusively in rural areas. Another version of this project could be sort of looking at state and local politics stuff, because the state of Oregon has divested pretty strongly in the last few decades from public services because of a various number of tax measures that were passed that basically gutted the state budget. And so there's these rural areas of Oregon, especially in places like Josephine County and southeast Oregon, the kind of more desert rural area, where there just simply are not public services. The libraries have closed down, the police force has gone away, there's like one guy at the fire station. The Patriot Movement, one thing they're doing is actually supplementing state services. It sounds nice when you say it, but when you think about it, it's a little scary, because there's these groups that are coming in and saying, we will police this town for you, or we will we will organize the community and have some kind of fire service. So you see that a lot in rural areas. And another part of the history of the Patriot Movement that I didn't talk about, which is also relevant, is issues with cattle grazers and cattle ranchers. The Malheur Bird Sanctuary, the Stick-Up.
Malheur is a great example of a lot of what Mike has explained on the right. The Malheur occupation was national news. On January 2nd, 2016, an armed far-right group seized and occupied the headquarters of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Harney County, Oregon. The group occupied the headquarters for more than a month on the grounds that federal agencies, namely the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the U.S. Forest Service, should turn over federal lands to individual states. Following a peaceful rally in Burns, Oregon, Ammon Bundy led an armed group to the refuge headquarters. Bundy's father had previously organized and led a similar incident 2 years prior, in March of 2014. Cliven Bundy led an armed confrontation between his supporters and law enforcement following a 21-day legal dispute with the Bureau of Land Management over $1 million in unpaid grazing fees. Cliven's ranch land was directly next to federally owned land. Thus, his cattle had been grazing on both his land and federal land, which requires the payment of grazing fees or a permit. The dispute goes back as far as 1993, when Cliven denied to renew his permit for cattle grazing on BLM-managed public lands near Bunkerville, Nevada. According to Cliven, the federal government does not have the constitutional authority to own large tracts of land. This argument was repeatedly dismissed by federal courts. The time between 1993 and the 2014 standoff was a constant battle between Bundy, who refused to file a permit or pay permitting fees, and the federal government, who asserts that Bundy's notion that federal government cannot own and manage large tracts of land is entirely false. Both Cliven and Ammon are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and believe that their armed opposition to the federal government is ordained by a divine message. Cliven does not recognize the federal court system or legal enforcement of any kind, believing instead that the federal government has no jurisdiction over him because he is, quote, a citizen of Nevada, not the territory of Nevada. In interviews, Cliven has utilized language associated with the sovereign citizens movement, which asserts that the county sheriff is the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country, with authority that outranks any of the federal or local enforcement agency or elected officials. His use of similar language to the sovereign citizens movement, in turn, brought him the support of the Oath Keepers, among other right-wing militia groups. Sovereign citizen extremism is considered by the FBI to be a domestic terrorism threat. It's within this lens of the federal government that Ammon Bundy began his campaign to the eventual occupation of the Malheur Refuge. Though it all begins with an entirely separate case. Two men, Dwight Hammond Jr. and Stephen Hammond, were convicted on 2 counts of arson on federal land in relation to 2 fires that they set, the first in 2001 and the second in 2006. The Hammonds agreed not to appeal the arson convictions in order to have other charges dismissed by the government in an appeals process. The Hammonds were told that the prosecutor would seek no fewer than the minimum sentence of 5 years. And ultimately, Dwight was sentenced to 3 months, while his son Stephen was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day, which both men served. In 2015, both sentences were vacated by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which then caused them to be re-sentenced. In October 2015, a judge resentenced the Hammond men to 5 years in prison with credit for time served. They were ordered to return to prison on January 4th, 2016. In November of 2015, the Hammond case drew the attention of Eamon Bundy and Montana militiaman Ryan Payne. Bundy and his associates began circulating information on social media and planning what they described as a peaceful protest. The protest was to be organized with the Harney County Sheriff, David M. Ward, to protect the Hammonds from being taken into custody by federal authorities. Ward, while sympathetic, declined Bundy's request. He later stated that he began to receive death threats via email following this interaction. But Ward was not the only one to reject Bundy and Payne's efforts. The Hammonds themselves, after several meetings, also rejected the offers for assistance. However, on November 5, 2015, Bundy and Payne insisted to Ward that he must shield the Hammonds from re-imprisonment. When Ward explained that he did not have the authority to keep men from serving their lawful sentence, Bundy and Payne became threatening, explaining, quote, thousands of armed militiamen would come to the county to, quote, do Ward's job for him. And Payne said that they might not be able to control what the militia might do. By late fall, it was noticed by local, county, state, and federal law enforcement that members of anti-government militias had started to relocate to Harney County. In early December, both Bundy and Payne had relocated to Burns, Oregon. They organized a meeting at the Harney County Fairgrounds to rally support for their efforts and organize a committee of safety, which considers itself, quote, a governmental body established by the people in the absence of the ability of the existing government to provide for the needs and protection of a civilized society. Local residents began to see a significant number of outsiders in the community, often dressed in military-style clothing and openly carrying guns. Some locals stated that these outsiders would occasionally approach them aggressively and ask them their opinion of the Hammond case. A fear that something violent was on the cusp in the community circulated. On December 30th, 2015, staff at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge were dismissed early. Tensions were high, and supervisors instructed staff to not return to the refuge unless specifically instructed. Some employees stated that the harassment and intimidation was growing as spouses and children of federal employees and local police said they were being followed home or to school by vehicles with out-of-state plates. Despite a forum held at the Harney County Fairgrounds on January 1st, an attempt to defuse the situation, the rally on January 2nd went on. About 300 people gathered in Burns, organized by the Pacific Patriots Network, an umbrella organization that includes the 3 Percenters of Idaho. Following speeches, the crowd marched to the home of the Hammonds before continuing on to protest outside the sheriff's office and the county courthouse. Before the crowd broke up, Bundy announced his plan to occupy Malheur Refuge and encouraged people to join him. Bundy, with his son Ryan and other armed associates, proceeded to the refuge headquarters. They settled into the refuge and established defensive positions. Law enforcement kept away from the refuge, as they had at the protest. The militia leaders claimed 150 armed members to be on site on January 2nd, though journalists reported no more than a dozen were there. Ryan Bundy stated that the group wanted the Hammonds to be released, and that the federal government needed to relinquish control of the Malheur National Forest. On January 3rd, Eamon said their ultimate goal was to, quote, get the economics here in the country revived, for logging and recreation. On January 4th, the group announced their name, Citizens for Constitutional Freedom. While Stephen E. Grassley, the judge executive of Harney County, and the county sheriff Ward, asked the Bundys to leave, the Hammonds reported voluntarily to serve the remainder of their sentences. Despite a meeting of the county sheriff and Bundy and Payne on January 7th, Bundy insisted the occupation would continue until the management of federal land in the country had been turned over to local residents. By the second week, members of other militias met with the militants, asking them to establish a perimeter around the occupied areas to avoid a, quote, Waco-style situation. New militia groups, including militants from the Pacific Patriots Network, led by Brandon Curtis, who also happens to be the president of the 3 Percenters of Idaho, arrived, but they left shortly thereafter. They were asked to leave and had been met with mixed reception. By January 14th, Bundy announced they would stay longer, and on the 15th, the Oath Keepers warned of a prospective, quote, conflagration so great it cannot be stopped, leading to a bloody, brutal civil war, if the situation descended into violence. The militants continued to occupy the space, searching through federal documents for proof of wrongdoing, vandalizing the property, and asserting the federal government would never get the buildings back. During the first few weeks, law enforcement had allowed the militants to come and go from the refuge, though on January 26, as the main leaders attempted to drive to the adjacent Grant County to speak at a public meeting, state and federal authorities used the opportunity to intercept them with a traffic stop. During the stop, Eamon Bundy and Brian Cavalier surrendered peacefully and were taken into custody. Lavoy Finicum refused the stop and kept driving. Authorities followed him. With police cars behind him, he finally stopped. The police launched foam-nosed pepper spray at his vehicle. Payne exited the vehicle and surrendered peacefully, though Finicum yelled at the officers that he intended to ignore their orders, as was recorded by a passenger in the vehicle. Another passenger recorded a video that showed Finicum taunting the officers and daring them to shoot and kill him. After 7 minutes of having stopped his truck, he resumed driving at a high speed. They were pursued and encountered a roadblock. An Oregon State Police SWAT member fired 3 shots with an AR-15 into the truck as it approached the roadblock. Finicum steered off the pavement to the left shoulder to avoid the roadblock and then embedded his truck in a snowbank. State and federal officers ran to the vehicle. Finicum exited the vehicle and began walking away from his truck, briefly raising and lowering his hands above his head. An Oregon State police officer began to approach Finicum with a taser, attempting to get within 15 feet to make an effective use. And Finicum turned his body to the left, holding his jacket with his left hand and reaching in a pocket with his right. He was shot by a member of the Oregon State Police. The FBI found a 9mm Ruger SR9 in his pocket. Bundy and the other militants arrested faced felony charges of conspiracy to impede federal officers from discharging their official duties through the use of force, intimidation, or threats. Despite the arrests, the occupation continued. On January 27th, through the guidance of his lawyer, Bundy urged those remaining at the refuge to stand down and go home. Several vehicles were seen leaving. By January 28th, only 4 militants remained. On February 11, 2016, all of the group had withdrawn or surrendered from the occupation, with several having been arrested after leaving the site. More than 24 of the militants were charged with federal offenses, including conspiracy to obstruct federal officers, firearms violations, theft, and depredation of federal property. The refuge headquarters remained closed until May 8, 2017, to install security upgrades, though the wetlands and roads remained open to the public following the occupation.
That's why you see a lot of this in rural areas, because the Patriot movement links up with the concerns of the so-called Sagebrush Rebellion, or these cattle ranching interests who really hate the impositions by the Bureau of Land Management. In 2014, they had an armed standoff and won. They successfully coerced the Bureau of Land Management to give Bundy his cows back. So, there's a lot going on here in the Northwest and in the Southwest and in rural areas with right-wing groups. Everybody had written off conservatives as dinosaurs, as crazy people. And then before you know it, they dominate government at all levels. And liberals are like, what the fuck happened? We thought that the New Deal state and the New Deal order was just going to go on in perpetuity. No, it's because it was a combination of intellectual elites at the top and grassroots organizations at the bottom that came together and developed a whole new politics around limiting government control. It called various things by various scholars and various analysts, call it neoliberalism, call it deregulation, call it whatever, which is now the norm. And in fact, the Democratic Party is also advocating those same policies. So it's shifting what constitutes normal. We have to understand that that's always in flux. And the only way to, when you're in the moment, you don't see it. But so the only way to see it is looking historically at change over time. And you see the origins of these things, right? Because if you were to say, just look at the Virginia protest in a vacuum, you would think, oh, that's weird, right? That's kind of bizarre and maybe a little scary. But it has this deep history, right, that connects, oddly enough, back to the Pacific Northwest. In order to react to these things, you have to know why and how they came to be. it's important for us to, I think, understand these groups, not just because they exist and therefore we ought to understand them, but because I think they are much closer to the American mainstream than we are often prepared to admit or are wanting to explore. Yes, they are extremists, in quotes, right? If your meaning of extremism means the use of violence to achieve political ends, then yes, these groups are extremists. But they both meaning left and right groups, emphasize some key values of American political culture and are able to organize around those values and around those historical figures and historical moments in ways that are resonant with your average American, in ways that are understandable to your average American, right? Every American learns about the American Revolution. Every American learns about the Boston Tea Party. You know, these groups, they tap into some very key components of American political culture that are deep-seated and deep-rooted that make up the mainstream. So while these groups might be extremists in the sense that they actively use violence, defensive violence, I think they would say, but they're tapping into something that most Americans will understand and can resonate with, and I think they are only going to become more and more powerful as time goes on. This theory of mine, my hypothesis, has been supported in recent months, where the most recent big event was in Virginia. The Virginia state legislature, this last election cycle, Democrats won a majority, and they were passing some novel gun legislation for Virginia, let's say, you know, background checks, that sort of thing. And I'm sure you heard about this. It was in the news for a while. Thousands of people showed up to protest this. And the protest was organized by the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the NRA working in coalition with each other, which was something very new. You can trace the history of that organizing strategy back to the Pacific Northwest because both Washington and Oregon state legislatures passed similar measures in recent years, and the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters of Washington and Oregon would show up to the State House and would protest it. But, you know, at best they might get 100 people to a rally, maybe, and nobody gave a shit because they had no power, and it was a blip in the news cycle and you moved on. But I think they learned from that, and they saw that in Virginia was a much more right political organizing opportunity because Virginia is a much more conservative state than either Washington or Oregon. It's a much more rural state than Washington or Oregon in some ways. Or maybe not Oregon, but certainly Washington. And it's also part of the South, right? So gun rights are a very big issue down there. And so they were able to mobilize and bring thousands of people to this protest. And what you see there is, at least for the right-wing patriot movement, you see them making pretty significant inroads into the mainstream conservative movement in ways they haven't before. So previously, militia and patriot organizing has really been at loggerheads with the mainstream conservative movement and the Republican Party. You know, they generally will, of course, vote for Republicans and they're conservatives overall. But, you know, they will condemn conservative politicians in the same breath as liberal politicians, as all agents of the big bad federal government. But here you saw them working in close coalition with state legislators, elected officials, who came to this rally, who spoke at this rally, who inspired the crowd. You saw NRA officials trying to de-escalate things in the protest, actively working with leaders in the militia groups saying, you know, if an argument broke out in the crowd, trying to calm people down and say, we don't need bad press right now. This is supposed to be a political thing. This is just about gun rights. And so for me, I think that's a really significant political development because we're seeing now the GOP is going to have less and less incentive to push away these more radical elements of the far right because they have such organizing power, right? They have demonstrated they can bring thousands of people to a state house to protest. And so you're going to see now, especially with Trump and with the alt-right, you're going to see all these threads connecting in ways that were impossible to imagine before or were too politically dangerous for Republican politicians to do before. And so they're going to become much more mainstream. And what that means is the militia's power and prestige is only going to increase. You're going to see a lot more of their issues on the political agenda, not just gun rights, but also severe Islamophobia, severe restrictions on immigration. These militias, the Oath Keeper Three Percenters, depends on which faction and which subgroup you're looking at, but they often work with Border Patrol, right? They will go down to the Mexican border and will go and do things beyond the scope of the law, and Border Patrol will let them. And in fact, they encourage it. And, you know, these folks will do things like go to common routes that Latin American immigrants will use, and they'll puncture and drain water from water jugs that are left there by humanitarian organizations. They're only going to increase more and more power, and we're only going to see more and more of them, so that means we're going to see more and more armed political organization and armed political demonstrations. And for the left-wing side, they are not nearly as coordinated or as large-scale as the right-wing groups. But I think in the wake of Trump's election, we saw all this stuff with Antifa, and everybody's suddenly is asking what the hell is an Antifa? The right-wing thinks it's this big conspiracy where they work with Democrats, which is hilarious. They're only going to increase, and so I think you're only going to see more and more escalation of this. Well, my worry is shots are going to rain out in some kind of demonstration that escalates too high. In terms of why we should care, I think we need to care because this is only going to get more expansive. It's only going to get more and more in the mainstream as time goes on. One thing I'm trying to carefully avoid in this project is a normative conflation of any of these groups. Because I think what you see in the mainstream media, and I would say even among mainstream political commentators and political scientists, is these are all just cases of extremism, and they have no place in the liberal public sphere, and they're both bad for the same reasons because they both advocate for violence. I'm trying really hard to not do that, right? Because I think there are moral distinctions to be made. And, you can hold a position that violence is always bad wherever you find it. But I think we have to keep in mind that, of course, the state perpetrates violence constantly, right? And state laws are only enforced through coercion, ultimately. So I think we need to take the left-wing version criticism of that approach seriously and think about, okay, rather than seeing violence as a carte blanche normative failing, seeing it rather as a political tactic, because that's how these groups see it, right? They see violence as an option that's on the table that might be necessary depending on circumstances. I think we need to carefully pay attention to that and not simply brush them away because it makes us uncomfortable. Because if we do that, then we're going to blind ourselves from the possibility of further understanding and making sense of what these groups are on about and what they want. And if we misunderstand them, then we risk dealing with them in improper ways that might escalate when they don't need to escalate. Really, the takeaway is don't have a knee-jerk reaction where you just think oh my god, these groups are all bad for the same reasons. No, there's much more complexity at work here. And these are real actors in American politics that we have to deal with.
Thanks for listening. I appreciate your support on this new project. I love to hear from y'all, so reach out on social media or email me at longstorypod@gmail.com. This podcast should be available on the listening platform of your choice, and if it isn't, let me know. Head over to that platform, rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help. Again, I am truly grateful for your support. Until next time.
So that was a lot, but that's sort of the broad idea.